Welcome to Daily Dose of Aramaic Grammar Lessons. This is Lesson 19, in which we'll be talking about infinitives, and more information on this topic can be found in Biblical Aramaic for Biblical Interpreters, pages 168 to 176. We've already mentioned that there are no infinitives absolute in Biblical Aramaic, and that it is somewhat possible that there was a place for an infinitive absolute in some dialects of Aramaic at some points in its history of development as a language. But there are no attested infinitives absolute in the Hebrew Bible, Hebrew and Aramaic Bible. So we can dispense with talking about two kinds of infinitive like Biblical Hebrew and just say the infinitive and know what we're talking about in Biblical Aramaic. And here's a chart of the strong verb forms for each stem. And really right up front, we notice that none of the internal passive stems happen to have infinitives. So there is no GP and of course no DP, and also no CP infinitive for us to keep track of or to study the morphology of. So we're going to start, as is traditional, with looking at the G stem, the pa'al. And something that we notice immediately is the mem prefix. And this is interesting. We don't expect there to be an integral prefix to the infinitive from our Hebrew intuition. And we notice, of course, it's unique to the G stem here for the infinitive. Now, we're not going to be confused about this mem prefix because non-G participles carry a mem prefix. We've seen a mem prefix before in the verbal system, but it was the non-G and GP participles that have a mem prefix. So actually there's not an overlap here. If we see a form that looks verbal to us that's in G, it's going to be an infinitive, not a participle. And then of course vice versa. If it's not G or GP that has a mem prefix, then that's going to be a participle. Okay, so that has to do with just trying to have an easy way to remember as we're doing our interpretation about that mem prefix. There is one infinitive in the Biblical Aramaic corpus that for whatever reason does not have that mem prefix, but this is standard. Okay, now the comets hey that we see on all the other infinitive forms, will that trip us up in our biblical interpretation? Actually, it should not. The only Biblical Aramaic verbal system use of the comets hey suffix, other than the feminine singular ending for participles, is the suffix for the perfect third feminine plural verb. And they're only in the Kare tradition of Daniel 5:5 and 7:20 for the pa'al perfect third feminine plural. So look at this. There is no confusion if we see a comets hey suffix on a verbal form what we're looking at. We're looking at one of these derived stems at the infinitive. Now, I have placed the distinctive factors for each of these stems in red on this slide. And we see how in the pa'al there's that mem that we've talked about, and with there's also the patah vowel. Let's look over now to the reflexive stems, the TG, and then over to the TD. We notice great similarities, obviously. They're exactly the same, with the exception that, as expected, the TD, hit pa'al, infinitive, is going to have a doubled middle consonant, whereas there's no doubling of the consonant for the TG hit pa'el. Looking at the D stem, the pa'el infinitive, there's that doubled middle radical. And of course the comets hey that we've mentioned before. And then finally the C, we have the hey prefix that we have come to be familiar with for the hafel C. Now I'd like to show something in Daniel 5:12. The afel stem also has an attested affinitive. So just as in the chart we can see the hey prefix for the hafel infinitive, we're going to see an aleph prefix for the afel infinitive in Daniel 5:12. And this is for the chet vav hey verb. There's the aleph infinitive prefix. Now, It's convenient to use this scripture passage because it supplies an example of an independent use of the infinitive in biblical Aramaic. The infinitive can appear independently and perform a noun's function in a clause. So you have explaining of riddles. You see that construct, explaining of riddles, in Daniel 5:12, where the infinitive is acting as a noun. There's also the complement use of infinitives. The infinitive predominantly appears after prepositions to complete a main finite verb. What are we talking about? Well, look at this. There's the yikul verb. That's the ability verb. And then the lamed and an infinitive. For there's no other God who's able, that's the ability verb, yod, kaf, lamed, to rescue, in Daniel 3:29. So we're calling this a complement use because who is able by itself needs a complement to finish it up, right? As an idea, able to do what? So able to rescue. And in a nice language accident, the lamed, which we associate with for or to, is acting like the English to in this circumstance of providing a complement. That's a sort of an accident in English that we can just use to our benefit as we are doing our biblical interpretation. And then there's the direct speech marker use of the infinitive in biblical Aramaic. It's not frequent. In one passage, biblical Aramaic, that form, lamemar, performs the role of direct speech marker like the biblical Hebrew lamor, which appears many times. And their reply to us was as follows. And then it would be very awkward if we inserted a saying, as many literalistic Bible translations like to do with the biblical Hebrew lamor. It is acting as a direct speech marker, and this is the aleph mem resh verbal root that we see there, and it's the infinitive of it, acting as a direct speech marker. And then we have the purpose use. The infinitive may express purpose, which is similar to frequent use in biblical Hebrew, in order to declare the interpretation to the king. And once more, the language accident of the lamed performing an English to function appears here, where to declare is the English infinitive, and it's providing an idea of why Daniel is doing what he's doing. It's in order to declare the interpretation to the king. And time expression. There's one example of an infinitive that communicates a time expression, which, of course, there are many of these in biblical Hebrew. And when he approached the den. So that kaf before the infinitive, the pa'algi infinitive, which we see has that mem prefix that we talked about earlier, that kaf prefix is performing a time function here that we saw way back when we talked about the prepositions on the time chart. Okay, so it's right after something happens. Okay, so, and right after he approached the den is sort of the meaning in Daniel 6:21, assuming that the kaf is performing a same function in this one-time expression in biblical Aramaic that it does in biblical Hebrew. Last thing we want to talk about with the biblical Aramaic infinitive is the idea of negation. The negative particle that's used with infinitives is la. So negative particle la plus hafel c infinitive sheen, noon, hey, and a statute that the king establishes may not change. So there's not a special infinitive negative particle like there is in biblical Hebrew. So we have as negative particles la and al. Al stands before the second person jussive in biblical Aramaic. All other negative particles are la and have this kind of use. So you see the frosted la there representing the idea of not change. Well, that brings us to the end of our discussion of infinitives. I hope you will stick around for lesson 20, in which we will sort of wrap up our grammar lessons for Daily Dose of Aramaic. We'll see you there.